It doesn't really matter what you're selling. It matters the value or the benefit that the client is getting out of that. And you have to be very empathetic, especially in situations where, the industry you're in or the sector you're in, because you could be selling something and the client is actually enjoying the actual what their value that they're getting could be something totally different or divorced from what you're selling. And it's very easy then for the negotiation, like you said, you're selling XY and there's a Z factor and it's not really being talked about. Let me make this more tangible. So if you were in a company and I was selling you like a watch, you would assume that you're talking about, okay, they're getting value from buying a watch because they could tell time. But it could be because they're buying a fancy watch for the prestige, or they're buying it. What they actually get out of the watch is they like, it could be a social status thing. It could be because it allows them to get into a particular club or space, this particular watch. So the watchmaker, if you go to a negotiation and you haven't gone through the actual customer experience or what they're actually getting from your product or service, the negotiation is not going to make sense to them. If you pitch them, well, I'm going to make the watch cheaper, or I'm going to make the watch tick faster or more accurately, that could be completely divorced from what they're buying. And I think a lot of times, especially in the type of services industry that you're in, having a check-in with your team and trying to run through a customer persona exercise of, okay, they've been consuming these services from us for the last year. What value have they actually been getting? Because if they're engaging with you, they're still getting something out of it, but it may not be what you are selling or the intention that you had in delivering those services initially. And that's going to cause a fundamental disconnect in the conversation. And sort of like what you're talking about, which is you're trying to continue this thread of how do we iterate on giving you a more value-adding service? But that could be from your perspective. If the client's actual value gain from the transaction is like sort of what I mentioned, it might be non-intuitive for you because they can talk that they are part of this organization. It's a status symbol for them. It's a prestige thing. It's them being involved in certain social circles or groupings. I mean, politics, especially, there's so many different motivations going on when you're talking about doing this type of work. And if you're not in tuned, or you can't confidently walk in and say, here's the service I'm providing, but here's what the value the client's actually getting, then the negotiation could be in a different planet. And that's going to also cause a lot of tension when you go into that. And that could, like I said, even more logical consumer goods. The benefits can sometimes be very far from what you think. And a company, this is for all companies, you lose track of what that value exchange looks like, then the communication is going to break down and the energy is just going to trickle down and you're going to feel that tension. So I would definitely recommend to anyone going into contract negotiations, especially in your space, to think about, okay, put yourself in the customer's shoes. What are they actually buying? What are they getting out of this relationship? And you have to start as that as like the central point for the negotiation.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, like you said, I've definitely found myself in spaces where I am probably very excited about one part of the project, but the client, quite frankly, like you said, just has a totally different priority. And I think sometimes I don't do a good job of catering to that because to me it seems stupid or useless. But that's not fair because the client does have a different perspective and they have their needs. And I think being able to pitch accordingly probably would make for a much more successful pitch because instead of trying to push everything. And it's funny because one time it crystallized specifically, I'll never forget, a couple of years ago with one client who I was pitching basically as a consultant to say, like, here's what, the services I can give to you. And a potential client came back to me and basically was like, well, if you want me to fund your effort, and basically made it clear that like he thought I was pitching like my idea and was basically like, help me like create this baby of mine. And there was this fundamental disconnect where I was sitting there being like, I thought I was addressing your needs. And they were so off base that the client basically was like, well, I don't know if you want me to, basically fund your efforts. And so I think, fortunately that hasn't happened that often since, but I think really trying to say like, instead of what do I want to deliver as a consultant, but more what are my clients interested in, probably would make for a less contentious price negotiation or any negotiation for that matter.
And I think there are two dimensions to the misalignment of value. One is the one we're talking about right now, where it's unclear, you're not 100% clear on what the client actually values or doesn't. But then even when there's alignment for what the value is, at all times, you're either enhancing the perception of that value or diminishing the perception of that value. And by giving things away, you're definitely diminishing the value. Even if it's valuable, and I'll keep coming to this word, you're perverting the value of it, because people take it for granted, or they believe they get what they pay for, so by not establishing the value and being confident in that value, you undermine that value. And that's the worst kind of misalignment, because then the client still needs whatever it is, and yet there's this expectation not to get paid for it. So we're taking the whole definition of value of whatever the customer is willing to pay, and you're saying, oh, the customer was willing to pay this, but because of my actions and my diminishing my own value, the customer is not willing to pay, or doesn't see it as value. So that you don't want to create that misalignment unintentionally or unnecessarily.